Okay, we are live. Good afternoon to everybody who's tuning in and watching. I have literally been waiting for this discussion all week, and I am so stoked that all of you were able to join us for this discussion. You've all been such big supporters of Pocket Lobbyist and are all such smart, intelligent public policy minds. And so to be able to have this discussion today is just like awesome. So I'm really excited. So thank you all for being here. It's like great. I mean, nothing going on really, just like an easy week in Canadian.
Yeah, casual week.
Literally. We were just talking before we went live here about how crazy things have been. And Scott, who is the vice president at the Business Council of Alberta, and Ruhee, who's the vice president at the Calgary Chamber, and Gitane, lifelong diplomat, principal at GT Strategic, very smart and involved so much of what's happening in this space. But Scott and Ruhee, both of your bosses were actually on the ground in Washington today. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you to relay some first thoughts. Scott, if you want to go first, and then we can go to Ruhee.
Yeah, absolutely. So the president of the Business Council, Adam Legg, and the head of the chamber as well, Deborah Yedlin, they were both there, and they were part of the same group. So I'll be interested to hear, Ruhee, if what you agree with or what you heard differently. But I think one of the key themes, first off, it wouldn't surprise anyone that it was just an enormous spectacle. That's one of the things that Adam described to me, and the world's eyes were really on DC, and the world was really sort of in DC in this moment. And just like we were talking about a minute before we came online, I think part of the question here is separating sort of signal from noise. And there's just been, Trump's been president for 3 days, and we've already seen more twists and turns than a Tarantino movie in some ways. So a couple of the things that actually are clear when you separate it out, and that Adam shared with me from on the ground. Let's take tariffs for one. We were expecting tariffs on day one. We didn't see them immediately. Then we saw the February 1st. The thing to take away from that is we don't know when we're going to see tariffs, but I'd say at this stage we do know whether. And the answer to whether is yes, those tariffs are going to come into place. The other thing that we've come away from the sort of the DC experience, and Adam shared with me, just totally convicted of, is that an approach of an eye for an eye will leave everybody blind. And so we've come away from this not supportive of the idea of sort of jumping into retaliation and how hard we're going to fight back, and it's particularly with an Alberta hat on, as that could really hurt us quite badly. And instead, I think that Trump's looking for wins, and to the extent that we can provide him some of what he's looking for at minimal damage to the Canadian economy, that's probably the other place that we need to be focused.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Ruhee, is that kind of what Deb and the other folks that were there in and associated with the chamber thought too?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest kind of unexpected things was just how many Canadians were down there. And I think that really does show just how important the relationship is, and that there's an appetite to work together. And so having a contingent of associations, of CEOs and business leaders from both Alberta and from Canada, I think just really emphasizes how critical that is. And from what I understand, very different than 2016, not just because it was dangerously cold, which I do chuckle. If it's dangerously cold, I don't know how they want us to be the 51st state at -6, but definitely kind of a different environment than 2016, but one that felt a lot more predictable, less sort of uncertainty. And we now know to expect the unexpected. And in some ways, that does actually make for a slightly more stable environment and an opportunity to work together moving forward as well.
Totally. And I mean, Gitane, you are the diplomat here or you're not a current diplomat, but you have so much experience in this space. You were there and in a pretty big role in 2016 and have had so many different roles with cross-border relationships between Canada and the US. And now you can work with Gitane in the private sector at GT Strategic because she's advising companies on how to navigate all of this. But what were your thoughts of differences between 2016 and this year's Gitane, and sort of any other observations right off the bat about the inauguration this week?
Well, I think, it was outdoor in 2017, right? It was a warmer day then. We did have a lot of Canadians down, but I think Ruhee is right, like a much bigger contingent. This go around, a lot more senior people. I think, people really are doing their best to engage with the networks that they have, with the contacts that they have, which will be crucially important. I think one of the really big differences this go round is that this time Trump is prepared. He has a strong team around him. He's appointing people. He's looking to move quickly on his agenda. I mean, he was a big fan of executive orders last go round, but that was a large number he signed on day one, right? So he's really seeking to take decisive action. I don't think the keeping Canada and the world off balance is new. He did that last go round. He governed by tweet, or whatever we call them now, X.
Yeah.
X's. So that is his modus operandi. He is a chaos agent. He likes to keep people guessing. That's part of his negotiating tactic. And I think this sort of, as Scott pointed out, the threat of tariffs, like if it's not February 1st, it'll be April the 1st. It'll be this sector, not that sector. So really that effort to keep us on our toes in order to push us to meet his demands. And I think it will be really crucial to look at where is it of benefit to Canada for us to do that.
Yeah, and there were so many, and maybe Scott and Ruhee, you can sort of point some of this out too, based on your conversations, but there were so many Canadians down there this time. I'm wondering, I would actually be so curious as to whether there was the same level of participation last time from just different companies and Canadians being represented there, and what we have so many different people advocating for Canada's interests right now. What is the impact of having people down there sort of advocating for Canada, or is it difficult because we're in such a limbo period right now with our own federal government? How does that sort of play out diplomatically and from an actual implementation perspective? Gitane, maybe I'll chat with you about that, and then Scott and Ruhee, if you want to jump in on what the Chamber and BCA are thinking about that.
Yeah, so lots of people come to inaugurations. It's a very typical thing. And I just say, Obama's first term as well, I think there's a big contingent of people for different reasons, right? So people go, it's a great opportunity to wave the flag. It's a great opportunity to network with Americans. It's a great opportunity to network with your fellow Canadians. So, but I do think this time people do feel they had to go because we're facing more of an existential threat, right? I mean, our economies are inextricably linked. Not that the facts matter right now, but I mean, the numbers are overwhelming. It is basically our only market for a lot of things. And if retaliation, I'm with Scott and Ruhee, we're going to just ratchet up the retaliation until we have some standoff and who wins. So we really do have to be strategic. We have to remember that this is not an equal relationship. In the eyes of international law, sure, we're both countries, but it's not an equal relationship. Right. So we're really going to have to be strategic, and we're going to have to swallow our pride a little bit. We're going to have to let some things go. We're going to have to not take the bait. And so I think really governments have to be working in partnership, more than ever with the business community, because Canadians, I think, are very divided on Premier Smith's approach to this situation. But she is working her contacts, and she does have contacts that the federal government does not. She and Governor Burgum, former governor of North Dakota, who's now going to be Secretary of the Interior, she's known him for a long time. Right? The federal government does not have that relationship with him. And so she can use that to Canada's advantage. She should absolutely be doing that. So I admire her for that. And I think industry is going to have to keep doing that too, because oftentimes those relationships, and especially with Trump drawing on people from the business world, it's our CEOs in corporate Canada that have those relationships, not government. And so I'm all for people leaning in and doing their best to advance Canada's interests.
Well, and
even
go ahead. Pick up on that. Sorry, Mel.
Yeah,
I think you're spot on into Mel, your question around the federal government and the state of that. I think the Trump administration has been very clear that there's more of an interest in connecting with the business community, and CEOs, from what I understand, are more likely to get meetings than some of our federal elected representatives, and that's not a slight on them. That's just an indication of just how important business is to the Trump administration. And so I think there's a unique opportunity for businesses to show up. And when we think about a Team Canada approach, that's not 13 premiers and a prime minister that we're talking about. That's businesses of all sectors, all sizes. How do we show up in the US in an organized way? And I think that's one of the biggest differences that we're seeing now versus in 2016, 2017. Trump expected to win. He's done this before. He is showing up with a full team of advisors and is ready to hit the ground running. And so to have Canadian businesses down there in full force, I think shows that Canada is able to match the tone that's being set of we're ready to be at the table, to negotiate, to build those relationships. There isn't sort of the same, obviously the first 100 days will matter a lot, but it's not in 100 days of sort of unstable transition and figuring out where we're actually skating to, we're ready to go now. And we have a clear sense of Trump's mandate as well. I mean, he has, it's very rare that the states will have alignment between the House, the Senate, the White House, popular vote. He does actually have a pretty clear mandate to just move forward with his big, bold agenda.
I think Gitane and Ruhee both. Oh, go ahead, Mo.
No, Scott, I want you to touch on this part too, because like I wrote down two things. So Ruhee said something like mandate, strong mandate. It is now, so I wrote down a question that basically said like, the way the business community interprets this, like in 2016, it could have been just like a mistake, like a whoops. It would have been easy, but now it's almost undeniable that this is sort of the ideological shift that the country is headed in. And I'm curious, Scott, as to your thoughts of whether like I think sometimes businesses think of political engagement and advocacy as being sort of partisan, but it's really just like a shift in like, okay, we care more now about business than we do. The background of the inauguration were the biggest companies, tech companies that exist in the United States. I was listening to a podcast this morning of the CEO of TikTok was sitting beside his new national security advisor. Like it's just a totally different realm. So Scott, if you want to pick up on that, I just think that's interesting.
I mean, businesses are focused on the Canada-US relationship in a way that they have not been basically in my entire adult lifetime. Like if we poll the businesses that each of us work with, I guarantee the number one issue with a bullet is the Canada-US relationship. And there have been long stretches that it wouldn't have even made the top 5. And that even dates back to when Trump came in the first time. You know, the level of concern and engagement from big CEOs and big businesses was more like passing interest, a little bit of concern about NAFTA, and now it's top of the list with a bullet. And I think there's good reasons for that, and some of which you've outlined in terms of the sort of the economic focus. And the other one that you're getting at a little bit is Canada's political situation is not ideal for this moment, and that's just the facts that we need to lay bare. We're not as strong as we could be, either in the near term, what we're kind of focused on right now, but also we haven't set ourselves up to be a really strong negotiating partner in this relationship over the long term. You know, we've been sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, not doing the things that we need to do at home, and because we've got one customer for most of our products, and we haven't done enough to diversify our markets, we're sort of in a more difficult place over the medium and long term as well. And I think that's a second reason why you're seeing some other audiences weigh in, why businesses are taking it more upon themselves. Frankly, they'd like to be as little involved in politics as possible, as we all know. They're trying to make 10 and 20-year decisions. The government's going to change several times over the course of that period. But business leaders increasingly to me are saying, you know, advocacy is now part of my job. I think that's also why you're seeing some premiers stepping up and stepping forward, particularly in Smith and Ford. And I know Smith is seeing it a little bit differently than most of the other premiers, but actually in many ways, I think, and our members think, that she's seeing it right. In fact, in the room just next to me there, we've got a number of our members speaking to some of the most senior federal officials, sort of explaining why Alberta is seeing this issue a little bit differently than other Canadians are.
And Scott, you bring up a good point, because I always say, you know, like I've worked doing government relations for the last 10 years, worked in government. Actually, that's where I first met Gitane, when I was very, 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 very green. And Gitane was so gracious. She was working in the government as the Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental. But being political is not the same thing as being partisan. And I think now more than ever, we have to like drive at that point. Being a business and acting from and understanding political knowledge and acting strategically and politically doesn't mean that you're waving a flag for any one political party. And I think you're seeing businesses realize that the stakes are a little bit higher now, and that they almost can't afford not to engage when it comes to that stuff. What is it like? One of the things, Gitane, that I always think of in politics and economics and anything that's happening is like everything we're seeing today is such a lagging indicator of what we've seen, you know, 6 months ago, 12 months ago. Ruhee and I were even talking about this weekend. Is it too late to change anything in the next 6 to 12 months? And are we now looking further down the line, or are there immediate things that from your experience in working with the US and some of these folks, are there immediate wins that Canada can have, regardless of what federal government that we have in place right now?
I think you actually need to flip it around, right? We need to give Trump some wins. Like, we just need to acknowledge this is an asymmetrical relationship. Their sticks are way bigger than ours. And to Scott's point about economic diversification, the government has tried for years, maybe not enough, but we have 15 free trade agreements with like 51 countries around the world. Oh, yeah. And our trade with our NAFTA partners is 5 times bigger than the next 14 combined.
Wow.
Right. And even with Trans Mountain Pipeline, you know, it is wonderful to have access to Tidewater, and I'm not denying that we should have more optionality. But the overwhelming majority of that oil goes down the U.S. West Coast to be refined in Washington and California. So we sit beside the world's largest economy, and we just have to accept that fact. So how, and I would also point out that a lot of what Trump is asking for is not inappropriate.
It's in our interest in many cases, right?
Right. Like, yeah. I mean, he's entirely unconventional. I'm not saying I support his approach, but asking Canada to pull its own weight when it comes to our own domestic security is not wrong, right? Pushing the world order to restructure international organizations in a way that is more fair and more accurately represents size of economies, distribution of populations than it did in 1945. That's okay too, right? How he's going about it, I'm not saying I'm support that, but I think we just have to acknowledge that some of what he's pushing for is not illogical. And also, he gave voice to a movement, right? So I was there in 2017 at his first inauguration, and it was either people thought it was an oops or they thought he would moderate. And I don't think people realized the force of people's support for some of the things he's speaking to. And, you know, we had Trump 1.0, then we have Biden, and Biden kept in place almost every protectionist measure that Trump had implemented, right? So this is what the American people want. So, like, wins for Canada, sure, there are things we can contribute. But again, I think we're going to have to really try to flip it around. What is the problem the Americans are looking to solve? Like, should we be better funding our military? Should we meet our NATO commitment? Should we do more on border security? Yes, there's things we can do on the drug side, which is not, people talk about, you know, the volume of drugs that cross the border is minuscule. That's not the point. Canada's real soft spot is money laundering and our banking system, right? And it's known that Canada has a challenge there. The federal government is stepping up and changing those relations, but those are the types of things where it's good for Canada. We should be doing that. And it also demonstrates that we're trying to be a true partner to the United States.
Ruhee, when it comes to, like, what are you hearing? So you and Scott both Calgary Chamber and the Business Council, respectively, both represent a lot of the same, like, individuals and, companies. But the Calgary Chamber arguably has sort of like more of a plug-in on the, like, small business, like mom and pop
100%.
aspect of things, right? What are you hearing from members about, like, are people just hearing tariffs, Trump? Are they just generally scared, and or are they asking about specific things? Like, what are people most concerned about when it comes to this U.S.-Canada relationship? And, like, what are you guys doing to sort of position some of these views? And how can businesses kind of get involved and have their voice heard in that respect?
It's a great question, and a lot of businesses are in different spots, and I don't think there's a lot of unanimity across our business community. A lot of small businesses are really struggling right now. Like 42% of Canadian exports come from small businesses, and retail is a top 5 export sector. So we often hear a lot about energy, and for good reason, but there's a lot of other sectors that will be impacted. And so our small businesses right now are really unsure about what the landscape will look like and whether they should still be exporting to the US. There's questions around what it's going to do to our exchange rate. Obviously, the Canadian dollar has not been in the strongest position recently. And even having a sense of what the job market's going to look like. We've seen some pretty staggering numbers across the country around what tariffs could mean for Canadian jobs. Of course, we know there'll be an impact on the US as well. But that impacts businesses' ability to make investment decisions, to think about how they want to grow. And I think there's another segment of the business community that feels sort of unsurprised by the position that we're in. And competitiveness, Scott, I know you'll want to weigh in on this too, but competitiveness has been such a big challenge for Canadian businesses. There's been so many conversations over the last several years about how difficult it is for Canadian businesses to expand across the country because of interprovincial trade barriers. Gitane, to your point around Trans Mountain, there's so many frustrations around, we just don't have the supply chains, whether it's energy or otherwise, to be able to access other markets. And Canada has full control over those things. And so this tariff conversation has really done a lot to highlight some of these challenges, but it actually hasn't exposed them. It hasn't created them. It's just sort of put a finer point on what a lot of the business community has been feeling already.
No, I totally agree with you. We're actually seeing the continuation of a story that was already in play, and a big bombastic personality like Trump, sort of focuses the mind on this week, but actually this week is not what it's all about. It's a much longer term issue, and I'd agree with you. Especially many of the largest companies would say they've been seeing the competitiveness pressure from the United States for quite some time. And that opens the door for me to talk about the trading relationship, because I think one of the messages that we need to get across is one that is not so much in Canada's, it's not a feather in Canada's cap, but it actually sort of exposes what's going on in the trade relationship. When Trump's talking about the huge trade deficit, he's almost entirely talking about goods, right? And not all that much about services. When you mix in services, the trading relationship is quite a bit more balanced. But actually, there's a whole different capital account to talk about in terms of the investment flows. And that's wildly in the U.S.'s favor. Canadian companies, Canadians invest more in the United States than they do in Canada. And this is what we've been hearing from these large companies, especially those who have business on both sides of the border for some time, is when they sit down, often in January, to allocate their capital for the year, they've been putting for many years more and more and more of it into the United States. And I think that's one of the points that we need to be making to the Trump administration, is the trade picture is a little bit bigger than how you might be seeing it.
That is such a good point, Scott. You and I have talked about that just in terms of like capital markets and entrepreneurship generally, and how Canada does things a little bit differently than the States. I mean, I keep going off on a whole tangent on sort of like the government funded entrepreneurship that we have in this country that doesn't happen to the same extent in the United States, and the strength of private sector capital in sort of reinvesting into the economy. This is also something that I've been thinking about too, because it's like, if we come back to the States, or if we come back to Canada for a second, I mean, I know Freeland and Carney have both said that they will reverse the capital gains inclusion rate changes. Freeland kind of going back on something that she herself actually introduced.
Less than a year ago. Yeah. It's a reversal, for sure. Right?
Politics,
a good reversal, yeah.
Yes. But and I don't like to be the type of person that speaks from full Milton Friedman economics of trickle down and all these types of things, because I obviously know it's an oversimplification. But if I'm sort of a Canadian that maybe has a small business, or I even work in the public sector, or I just don't really necessarily have that much connectivity to what's going on in cross-border ways, when we make it more difficult for companies to access and grow capital in Canada by what's happening between Canada and the US, I do think that does have an impact on other aspects of society, right? Whether that's companies who would maybe you're looking at a big oil and gas company that may have money set aside for investment in new technology, et cetera. The reality is that businesses do make decisions based on their bottom line, largely. And so I don't know if Scott or Gitane or Ruhee, if you want to jump in on that, but I do think that's an interesting point.
I can't wait to say, and I want to hear from my friends as well, but I think Melissa, you have actually circled in on what one of the primary challenges for us, I would sort of collectively call us public affairs professionals, which is that these big investment flows where companies are putting capital and what's happening in international trade feels very disconnected from household economics and sort of kitchen table budgeting to the average person. But actually, that's the connective tissue that we have to make. And right now, the tier one issues for Canadian people are affordability, cost of living, sort of their overall prosperity. And I think Canadians are right to be grumpy because you can see that our economy has decoupled from the United States. We're probably 20% worse off today than we would have been if we'd continued on the same trajectory as the United States. But so many of those decisions happen in the abstract. They're these big sort of capital flows. And I'm trying desperately hard to find the best ways that we can connect those things back to the kitchen table.
Well, and I think too that some of it is around just the signals that we send to Canadians and to our trade partners as well. And a lot of the conversation around capital gains was it'll only affect this many people to this extent. And sort of the forest through the trees is Canada has become a less business-friendly place to invest. And I think we see a similar notion with some of the legislation that the US has seen as particularly targeted towards them or disproportionately impacting them around Online News Act and Digital Streaming Act. And so it's sort of not just about the specific single public policy. It's that the market does take direction from the public policy decisions that are made. And we see that in the US with the changes that are happening, but we also see it in Canada. And that has resulted in a lot of investment flowing south of the border. Scott, to your point, there's so much investment that flows to the US, and part of it is not just because the US is a great place to invest, but it's because of a series of public policy decisions that have varying levels of real impact, but also have a really significant signal to the market where a good place to invest is.
I have so many thoughts on this. Let's
hear them all. We have so much. I love it. I love it. This is what's getting good. It always takes 10 minutes. We open up and now we're into it.
So I spent like 8 years of my professional life living in the United States representing Canada. So I served at the embassy in Washington twice. I was also in Chicago. I mean, American culture, they just encourage and embrace competition so much more than Canadian. Like there are some fundamental cultural differences between Canada and the United States. Canadians are much more British in a lot of ways. And I think that self-deprecation, that sort of sense that being the winner all the time is bad, that being rich is bad. Like I'm really simplifying things, but there is a cultural difference there that is not working to our advantage. So that's in part why governments can implement policies that are contrary to our interests in terms of like economic competitiveness or productivity, because there is sort of this sense that, things need to be more fair than they are. And I'm not saying that's wrong or bad, right? I'm all for, let me be clear, all for publicly funded healthcare, all for a great school system, all of those things. Yeah. But we are competing on a world stage. If you look at our economy, it's very export based. So we need to get smarter in that regard, right? And there's lots we can do. We've talked about interprovincial trade barriers and other things. Like there's things we can do to help ourselves at home. But we can also, like at the provincial level, why do we not teach kids about entrepreneurship? Like I have kids in high school, they take COM, career and life management. There's some great stuff there, but we don't teach kids about taxes. We don't teach them about investing. Mm-hmm. We don't teach them about, your different options. Like, I come from a family of tradespeople and farmers. Wonderful. I went to university, different career path, right? But we don't talk about that sort of, the stats about it's kids who get C's who actually start businesses, run businesses, right? Like we in Alberta have a very entrepreneurial mindset, and I don't know why we're not doing more to encourage that. Like as a parent and as a human being, that just drives me crazy. So I think we need to do more there. And then the other thing we really need to think seriously about on the investment front is a big deterrent to international investors is the volatility of our dollar. Right? Like when I went to DC the first time, our dollar was worth 62 cents, right? We're headed that way again. And then my second time living in the States, our dollar was higher than the American dollar. So one Canadian, like it was $1.10 for every American dollar, right? And now we're back in the 70 cents. So for an investor looking to put their money in and maybe get a return in 5 years, they might know what the percentage rate of return will be on that investment, but they have no idea what the currency is going to be worth, right? So that speaks to the underlying fundamentals of our economy. And so we need to address that, because if we had a more stable dollar, then that would be another way. I mean, there's all kinds of other things we can do, but that's something people don't talk about a lot, is the volatility of the dollar and what a detriment or a deterrent that is to foreign investment. I'll stop. I could go on all day.
No, we like it if you go on all day. You've got so much like experience in actually dealing with these issues on the ground, and I think like that is something that I can't remember if it was Ruhee or Scott or Gitane was you, but just even talking about some of these things happening in the abstract. Like, I'm very curious as to your thoughts in terms of like tone, Ruhee was saying, tone is everything in many ways, right? And I can't even remember who had said it now, but the protectionist, I think it was Gitane, saying that Biden kept a lot of the protectionist policies that Trump had put in place. Even on immigration, there's a story there to tell with respect to like what Obama did in that area. I'm curious as to how we are looking, like what is the cultural lens right now that both businesses and organizations and public affairs professionals like us, what is the cultural and like societal lens that we're looking through as we interpret what Trump's doing? And how do we signal and noise separate some of what's happening? Like, what are the actual things and actions that we need to be concerned by when it comes to this Trump administration? And what are some things that we'd probably rather not hear Trump talk about or say, but the impact for that Canada-US relationship is perhaps in effect a little bit less than some of the other things? Like, what are the things that are actually moving the needle when it comes to the pomp and circumstance that is Trump and his whole entourage and everything that's happening there? Like, I just feel like there's a story there to tell. So I don't know, Ruhee or Scott, if you want to go first, but.
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think you're right to say it's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And actually what he wants, he's been very, very clear about. And I think the biggest challenge for businesses and for Canadians broadly is to separate sort of the wheat from the chaff. And he's made it clear that he wants action on borders, that he is tired of feeling like the US is funding global security measures. He said, I think this morning, we just want to be treated fairly. And I think he means it when he says that. He feels that the US has played an outsized role in defense and security across North America. And frankly, he's not wrong. He's made it clear that he wants to deliver tax cuts, and tariffs are going to be part of the way that he offsets that revenue. And so there's a lot of noise around, is it February 1st? Is it April 1st after there's the investigation on what the trade deficit really looks like? But ultimately, he wants a better deal with Canada. And so I think really to distill it, whatever the advocacy efforts are, to be able to distill the efforts into, as Gitane said, finding a win for Trump. And I think there's a lot of areas of mutual alignment. I don't love the tools that he's using, but I think they're shouldn't be totally surprising to Canadians given sort of our track record, and that we have, in fact, been a disproportionate beneficiary of the US's investment in security over the last several years, if not decades. And so, yeah, I think really that's sort of the area of focus.
Well, and Ruhee, I think you did a good job of identifying some of what is important. So maybe I'll take the role of saying what's not important, or what the chaff might be. I think we have to step back a little bit, and actually, I'd like to suggest to Canadians that we use chill as a strategy. We actually have to.
Let's put that on a license plate. Chill as a strategy. Strategy, chill.
Yeah, strategies. Remember, Trump hasn't really done anything yet with respect to Canada-U.S. trade, and think how much he's created. You know, before he was even president, he managed to get us spending billions of dollars on the border just based on statements he was making. An effort that I support, but you have to think about what he's been able to do by just with only his words, and actually sort of pausing and being thoughtful and strategic, and not reacting. You know, I think, as we were all saying on Monday, there were 3 different timelines on Monday for when we might see tariffs. Monday, Feb 1, and April 1. And that made all of us and pretty much everyone in Canada, run up and down and zigzag all over the place. I think we need to step back from this and realize that this is the most successful relationship between any 2 countries on Earth, maybe any 2 countries in the history of the Earth, and that it will continue for a very long time. And we don't need to be making knee-jerk reactions 3 times a day. I was just reading recently, the last time that I'm aware of the sort of widespread tariffs like this were tried by the United States was Nixon, who did 10% across the board tariffs in 1971. Canada did not retaliate significantly, and those tariffs lasted about 9 months because of the inflationary pressure in the United States and sort of the pressure that came on Nixon to take them off. And then the other thing that's just so clearly obvious, Trump is a classic anchorer. He's using the classic business negotiating strategy of anchoring. He's written a book on it, and basically he just threatens something that's way out there, so that when you meet somewhere in the middle, you thank him for it, or it seems much more reasonable. And so we don't need to necessarily jump at every one of those. Today was 5% of GDP. Well, the U.S. is not even anywhere close to 5% of GDP on defense. I think this is another one of those sort of anchoring strategies, and using chill as a strategy. I'm going to make a bumper sticker. I think has got to be part of the plan.
Well, and Scott, if I can add to that, I mean, I think we're one of the best positioned countries in the world in terms of U.S. relations. Like, there are very few other countries that I would rather be, given our trade relationship and the extent to which the U.S. actually does rely on us. And this will be a long-term relationship, and so we should act like it. I mean, we've sort of circled around retaliation and all of our thoughts on that. But if this is a nation that we'd like to keep as our best friend for a long time, I don't know that retaliation is really what sets us up for success. And are we backing ourselves into a corner sort of on our own volition when we actually could be coming at this from a position of strength?
I mean, I would say a few things that, when they stay in real estate, it's all about location, right? But it's also who your neighbors are. We can't up and move, right? If we don't like this, we have no option, right? So we have to figure out a way to make it work. And we are the envy of a lot of the world because of where we sit. And I would also say that security talks, right? So yes, we have this deeply intricate, interconnected economy, but you look at who the US respects, and it's their partners on security, right? So even Australia has the upper hand to Canada there in a lot of regards, because they work really closely on a few security issues. Same thing as the UK. And I don't want to diminish the contributions of the Canadian forces over the years, because they have been considerable. And also, it was to the US advantage for a long time that Canada didn't really have a big enough military to fully defend our landmass, because it was essentially a way for the US to push its border out, its security border out all the way to the North Pole, because we worked in cooperation, right? But now for Americans, the world is a very scary place, right? Trump ran on messages largely around fear, and that sells, right? So the world is big and scary. Everyone's out to get them, even though they created a world system after World War II, where they made a conscious decision to basically be the global police officer and be able to fight all these wars, proxy wars, direct wars, all the things. And now they're finding that isn't working for them. So they want to
secure all global trade, as well.
Right? All of it, like get rid of the W2, all of the things that people fought for. So Canada's going to have to think carefully, because we are a small population base, middle power trading nation that relies on these international structures to advance our interests. So in this new world order, as opposed to multilateral based institutions to deal based relationships, like what kind of deals do we want to make with the US, and who else are we going to get into bed with to protect those interests if these larger institutions aren't doing that for us anymore?
And I think, okay, this is actually like a great segue. We did have some people kind of like get in some questions. And one of the questions that's coming from our audiences across social media is about how this new era of Trump is going to change those multilateral relationships. Like, he's already made several announcements and executive orders about a lot of these different institutions. And I just, from a purely just observational perspective, I find it interesting, because it does seem to be like there's this like retrenchment from that liberal world order to sort of maybe more of a realist calculation, but while also espousing a lot of the ideas of like manifest destiny, like sort of city on a hill, these types of things. So I just find it interesting, like so much of what, with great power comes great responsibility, and these multilateral institutions and these engagements and entanglements that the US has been involved in over the years is part of the responsibility. But as we look at great power competition across the world, and I think this is especially relevant for, big companies that are looking at trade, where manufacturing is happening, even small businesses like that are manufacturing items, like what are we looking at when it comes to the new calculation for global power, and how is that going to impact businesses in Canada and Alberta? Scott, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Well, I'm dying to hear what Gitane has to say about that in terms of the international institutions, but I'll have a little bit of a crack at it. I think I think one of the things that's happening right now is frankly companies are looking at doubling down in the United States. That's the truth of it. That the United States looks like at the moment it's going to be an attractive place to do business for the next while. And in a multipolar world, one of the things that businesses are needing to do is make decisions about where they're going to do business and where they're going to put their money. And for most of the last couple of decades, we're living in a world that was just opening up more and more and more. And if you were doing business in a few countries, you'd do it in a whole bunch more if you could. Now businesses are actually being much more selective and sort of considering what the future sphere of influences are going to be like and what the international relations are going to be like as well. Gitane, I want to know what you think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you have to decide either you're in China or you're with the US. So it's not only are you in the US, but are you in China? And you also have to understand Vietnam's a proxy for China, Hong Kong's a proxy for China. A lot of people feel Mexico's a proxy for China, but even you have to understand how geopolitics are shifting and make some conscious decisions. We are getting more into as opposed to a multilateral situation, a team sport type of situation. So you're gonna have to pick a side, right? Which is hard and challenging, and everything has ups and downs, but you're actually gonna have to make some hard decisions, right? And I think related to that, the whole situation with Mexico, which we haven't really talked about, and Doug Ford's taken a strong position that, we should cut Mexico off. There's a lot of Chinese investment in Mexico. It's still a developing country. It needs the investment for job creation and all kinds of things. But Mexico is the US's #1 trading partner. So what happens to the Mexican economy impacts the US economy, and the US economy impacts our economy. So again, this is a situation where you've got to be playing chess, right? You cannot just be playing checkers. And I get you want to, on one hand, you got to take sides. It's a team sport, but then you also have to understand what the consequences of that are. So are there ways Canada can work with Mexico on some things of mutual interest, right? Because we are one continent and the economies are so integrated that if Mexico's economy takes a huge hit, that's going to impact us too. So we've got to be thinking those kinds of things through.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I was surprised recently when I was looking up the stats, Gitane. You're absolutely right. Like Canada, the U.S. and Mexico is now the world's largest trading relationship. It kind of bounces depending on the year between the U.S. and either us or China or Mexico. We're often in that position, but that's the biggest trading relationship in the world right now, and it's going to have a huge impact.
So Ruhee and Gitane and Scott, all of you, how do we navigate all of that? It strikes me that there is going to be we haven't even talked about the fact that Canada is hosting the G7 in Kananaskis in June, and who knows who our prime minister is going to be at that point. We literally don't know. It is not going to be Justin Trudeau, whether it's still a Liberal prime minister or a different prime minister. How I want to get into talking, Gitane touched on it, some of the premier and different voices that are kind of in these discussions. How do we not, for lack of a better term, hamstring ourselves while we're figuring out our own internal politics? And how do businesses stay out of the political fray of domestic politics while still being political and engaging in US politics? Ruhee, I don't know if you want to go first on that or...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a bit of a relief on the G7 that we at least sounds like won't be in an election. We'll either have an election that's wrapped up by then or it'll get punted to the fall. So I think there was a bit of a fear of what happens if we effectively don't have a prime minister during the G7. But ultimately, part of what Canada needs to think about is well beyond Trump. And it's actually... there's going to be challenges and opportunities that come with the next 4 years, but we are looking way further beyond that. And so I think to be able to zoom out as premiers and as domestic policy and think about where Canada should be long-term, we struggle a lot with short-termism in Canadian politics. And I think really it's going to come down to, can we stop tripping over our own feet? Knowing that there's going to be political change, and polling indicates that quite likely we will have a change of government in the coming months, but that we'll have a lot of premiers who are here to stay. And perhaps there's an opportunity for the business community to be the voice of stability through this. there's a ton of credibility that the business community has both with Canadians and south of the border, and that might be the opportunity there as well, as to just really lean into that.
And like, does this necessarily even, like, I think, listen, I do think that probably the Conservatives are more ideologically aligned in many ways at a high level with the Trump administration, but like, it's not like they're lockstep, right? So it's not like if we have a different government in Canada, things are going to get so much better, so much more quickly, unless that person, whoever, or like Poilievre and the Conservatives or whomever forms a government, unless, and this could even exist under a new leader under the Liberal Party as well, unless that person is willing to like give Trump those wins. But then, as Gitane says, but then I go back to this whole psychological question of like, dealing with somebody with like Trump and engaging with somebody like Trump, like it's almost not just as simple as like, oh, we play for the same conservative team. It's literally more of a like psychological engagement, I think, that you have to think about when you're engaging with somebody like Trump. And it is more of like a power dynamic than it is like, oh, we speak the same language. And so that's why I think that there's some reason to maybe have hope on the US-Canada relationship if there's a change in government, but like I don't think that's like a shoo-in, everything is going to get better if that happens necessarily. Gitane, what do you think?
There is no silver bullet.
Yeah.
What we actually need is true leadership. We need someone who's got strong diplomatic skills, negotiating skills, who actually understands the economy. I think that people that think a change in Ottawa will make all the problems go away, like that's very naive, right? Like this is going to be a bumpy relationship for a while. And I think, there absolutely is an opportunity for like the real true Team Canada approach would be, let's get leaders together, federal, provincial, business, talk about who has which relationship, agree with a strategy, and empower people to do that, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge that a leadership race in the Liberal Party at this point in time is not awesome, right? It's not ideal timing for Canada. So, and if the federal government wants to do what's best for Canada, then people should acknowledge that and say, okay, Premier Ford, you've got this relationship. Premier Moe, you've got this relationship. Like, you do that. Heads of big companies, you have these conversations. Let's all, and keep working together. Canada's not unique in this regard, though. Like going back to the G7, like Germany's a mess. The government in Italy changes very regularly, given their France has had its hiccups. Like, we're not the only one, right? Progressive governments around the world are being thrown out in favor of more right-wing governments. So it's not only Canada that might have we are hosting, that makes it more challenging, but this is not a unique situation to us. The timing is not awesome. So let's figure out a way to use the resources that we have, the relationships we have, the people we have, and actually empower them. It doesn't have to be all about the federal government. Like, you can actually work as a team.
I totally agree. It doesn't have to be all about the federal government. And virtually every senior business leader I know is sort of leaning into this and planning more advocacy in the States. And we've seen it from premiers as well. And I totally agree with you, Gitane. We need to figure out who's got what relationships, because I think one of the most powerful ideas in all of communications is that you'll like my qualities better if you hear them from someone else than if you hear them from me. And so just think about how that plays out in, say, the energy story, right? That we all know that Canadian energy is sold at a discount to the United States. It's a net benefit to the U.S. And their refineries are tuned for it, all those good things. But that story, I think, will hit the Trump administration very differently if told by American companies than if told by Canadian politicians necessarily. And Canadian politicians should do that, tell that story as well. But they need to be hearing that from the American sort of refining sector. And on that same front, while we're talking about energy, you were saying we got to play chess, not checkers. I think this is one of the reasons why Premier Smith has been so vocal about the fact that we shouldn't even be musing about sort of cutting off energy supplies, and that's why she's been seeing things a little bit different than other premiers, and I think has largely been right about this. So the U.S. has threatened big tariffs on us. That's going to hit energy very significantly. And we started this conversation talking about it. The very first thing we started talking about was, well, I guess we need more infrastructure because we need more customers. Yeah, and wouldn't it be great if we had that? Well, just play out the chess moves. If we, in any way, shape, or form, cut off energy supply to the United States or made it less secure, they're going to have the exact same conversation on their end, which is how do we become less dependent on Canada in the long run? And so, we got to be thinking for longer than months and even years at this. We need to be really long-term strategic about it for a day when there will be one day a different president as well.
And also, like, this goes back to the culture. Oh, Gitane.
Technology.
That's okay.
No, I was just gonna say, like, you need Americans to make the argument no Canadian politician can make, right? Like, they make a ton of money off our cheap oil, which no Canadian politician is going to say, but that is the reality, right? So you're absolutely right. We need them to carry that message because that's not something that's politically palatable for us to say at home.
Well, and one of the conversations that we've been hearing from our members is now actually the best time to be building more energy infrastructure to the US. We know that the US demand is going to continue increasing and that our best shot at getting more infrastructure into the States might actually be under this president. And so if we're thinking long-term and we're thinking beyond the next 4 years, we need to have sort of a both and solution to, can we increase our optionality so that we actually do have more bargaining power? And even if it is, a similar situation to TMX where we have access to tidewater, but much of the oil still goes to the States, that still provides us with leverage and access to new markets, many of which might be in the US, and all of those options need to be on the table. And I think really not seeing a lot of this, the negotiations and the opportunities in front of us as being an either or. And even if I can go back to the Team Canada approach, there was a lot of conversation about, well, Smith has just decided that she is out of Team Canada. And I personally don't agree. I think there has to be an opportunity for business leaders, for governments to be able to have differences of opinion and to be able to say, in an ideal world, I can stand with Team Canada, but at the same time, I'm elected to represent certain interests, and those will not always be aligned. And that doesn't mean that we can't still have a united front and have opportunities to work together. I think it just cannot be an all or nothing. It's not that we all have to be in lockstep every single step of the way to be able to still be working collaboratively together.
Well, two things there. I mean, cutting off Canada's oil exports to the United States is actually contrary to Canada's economic interest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? If people haven't read it, Trevor Toome had a great article on the Hub this week. Read it, understand it. It's important everybody get that. And also, yes, people can disagree, but it's not a great negotiating position when you're airing your dirty laundry in public. Like, it would be far better if there actually was a strategy. I'll be good cop, you be bad cop. Right? If there actually was some type of coordinate, like, people are going to disagree, but I don't think it's awesome. It plays into the other side's hand if they see divisions, right?
This is going to sound so unsophisticated, and that's like my specialty. But I literally, like, sometimes I think so many people see these types of problems and issues. Like, we see like US-Canada relationship, like, we almost think that these relationships and these dynamics work so much differently than like a marriage or a friendship or like in your own office. Like, I think that obviously I'm oversimplifying right now, but like, I think that the best relationships and friendships and business partnerships that I have ever seen in my time are relationships that play infinite games, not finite games, where you're not saying I'm a winner, you're a loser. You're literally just doing everything that you can to keep the game going and to keep things in play. And sometimes that means like you're sitting on the sidelines and you're supporting the other person more. This goes back to what Gitane was saying about the cultural differences at the beginning. I feel like we're so proper in so many ways, right? Where we're like, oh, but that's like not the way we do it. I feel like the US is just like, we are headed due north, or not due north, that's because that's Canada, but like we are headed in direction X. Sorry, I don't want to be invoking any like too much manifest your destiny, but not north than the 49th parallel.
Manifest all the destiny you want. Yeah.
But I feel like the United States is basically just like, hey, listen, we are going to be rich, successful, prosperous, and like this is the train that we're on. And like, get on if you want to, don't get on if you don't want to, but that's where we're going. I feel like this mode of like consensus building in Canada within our system of government is like good in so many ways, but it kind of like distracts us from what the goal is sometimes. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but I just think we should treat this more like Would you do that with somebody you were like trying to get back together with, or that you have 5 children with, or that you share a home with? You know, like it's not realistic.
I think the relationship dynamic, I think it's a totally relevant way to look at it. And I don't think it's necessarily an oversimplification. Well, and I believe great communicators are great simplifiers. And I've been kind of thinking of parts of this through the relationship dynamic. You know, you talked about the zero-sum game aspect. You know, we've probably all been in relationships where people are keeping score of how much one person is doing, putting in, how much the other one is doing, putting in. And hopefully we've all been part of relationships where you're all putting in as much as you possibly can. And I can tell you the second one works way better than the first one does. And then also this relates to some of what we were talking about how we might want to approach this. You know, I have a wonderful partner. Her name's Chantel. Many of you know her. Chantel comes to me and says, hey, there's 2 or 3 things that I'd like to be different in this relationship. And I go straight to the nuclear option. That's probably not going to go great for the future of our relationship. I can tell you that much. So much as me sort of sitting down and saying, great, how can we work together on some mutual wins here? How can I address the kinds of things that you're bringing up?
Yeah, I go back to what I said before. We can't move. Right? So we're family. We have to figure it out.
That prenup is ironclad. We're not going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere, right? So we have to figure it out. And it is that, you know, the most basic way I explain it is the 2 mottos, right? The US, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Canada is peace, order, and good government.
Yeah.
Tells you something in and of itself, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I recognize we're about 4 minutes away from being done here. I want to give all of you folks the opportunity for 1 or 2 minutes to just close off on, first of all, what you're hopeful for in the future, and what you're doing in your own sphere to try and contribute to that hope and positivity of this relationship. I feel like we could literally chat all afternoon, and I wish we could, but I know you folks are busy. So let's leave it on a positive note. Let's start with you, Ruhee, in terms of, you know, positivity, optimism. What are you looking forward to, and how is the chamber and the efforts that you're doing there contributing to that?
I appreciate so much ending this on optimism, because I feel like there's so much hair pulling out that's happened this week, and it's going to be a long 4 years if that's the attitude that we approach it with. So I'm really hopeful that it's actually an opportunity for us to think as Canada about how we set ourselves up to be really competitive. And I wish that the push to get us here wasn't an external force, but at the same time, like, we actually, the situation we're in with having quite a bit of political change likely gives us an opportunity to think about the direction that we want to head in. And Canadians have an opportunity to set the ballot box question and to decide and communicate to whatever party the direction that we'd like to go in. And at the same time, communicate to business leaders. And there's really a lot of opportunity for influence, and to decide that we want to be a nation that steps up, that is competitive in our own right, and that has a lot of opportunity. And in terms of the positivity and where the chamber's at, part of what our job will be is to decipher the noise. There'll be an incredible amount of noise over the next 4 years. And that in many ways is actually predictable and gives us some certainty. It gives us the opportunity to think about what really matters to our business community, to our economy, and lean into where the opportunities are instead of running around with our heads cut off.
Scott, you want to go next?
Sure. You know, I agree with everything Ruhee said. Let's not let a good crisis go to waste, right? This provides an opportunity for us to do some things, to find some political will, things like interprovincial trade barriers, you know, that have been stuck with us for decades. We may be able to knock those down. And quite frankly, I also, on an optimistic front, I can imagine a future where the Canada-US relationship is better and stronger after we get through this sort of period of storming, like a classic team. You know, we'll get through it on the other side, and I think we're going to have a great relationship for the very long term. And you know, in terms of what I'm doing and we're doing, it's spending as much focus as we possibly can on the Canada-US relationship, and it's going to mean for me a bunch more time in the United States this year. And probably the note of optimism that I'd leave people with is just back to that. Let's use chill as a strategy. Let's use our great Canadian calmness to approach this with clear heads and a long-term view. And if you need any spark on how to do that, my note of homework for everyone is go listen to the Planet Money podcast, one of the best podcasts ever. One of my top 5 podcasts of all time is their episode 425. It's an FBI hostage negotiator buys a used car, and it will tell you everything you need to know about the way that Trump's negotiating strategy works.
Is it with Chris Voss?
Yeah, I think it might be actually.
He is like so good. Honestly, I can't say that enough. So chill is a strategy. Keep calm and carry on, to invoke the British element. But yeah, that's a great plug. Gitane?
Yeah, or as my friend Gary Marr says, if you're going to panic, panic responsibly, right?
I love that. Oh my
Well
gosh.
said.
Okay.
Don't panic in public. Do it responsibly behind closed doors. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're all in violent agreement, right? We absolutely should. This is an opportunity for Canada to get its house in order, right? Address interprovincial trade barriers, depending on the report. You can look at a bump to GDP, I think it's between 3% and 9%. So it's a big lift, right? If we can actually use this moment to get that right, to get a serious look at our economic policies, take a serious look at our infrastructure system, right? I mean, it takes like 10 to 15 years now to get a mine up and running in Canada. If we want to be a leader on critical minerals, we need to get moving. So there's tremendous opportunity with this laser-like focus to get stuff done. How I'm contributing. So in my consulting business, I spend a lot of time demystifying Trump and helping people to understand how to navigate these choppy waters. I'm also a global fellow with the Wilson Center out of Washington, D.C. with the Canada Institute. So there I'm contributing to some policy proposals for Canada, US, and North America broadly. And it's always fun to work with other smart people. And then I'm also on the board of the Public Policy Forum. And if people haven't read it, the PPF has a Canada, US Matter More strategy, which has some concrete solutions in it there. So it really is making, rather than helping people to understand that everybody can make a positive contribution in this regard, right? We are very fortunate in that we have basically 40 million Canadians who know 40 million plus Americans, right? Like we have the relationships. We just have to figure out how to get the message across to the right people to advance Canada's interests as well as the US. So tremendous possibilities here for sure.
I love this so much. Thank you, all of you. So I have my key messages is hire Gitane, join the Business Council, and join the Chamber as part of this whole discussion. And obviously make sure that you're following and engaged with Pocket Lobbyist as well, because we are so grateful to have all of you guys in our network to really work collaboratively together on the ideas and make those more accessible to people. So nobody is scared of what's happening. We want people to feel like they can contribute, that they can move forward. And it sounds like there's amazing opportunities with Business Council of Alberta, Calgary Chamber, and GT Strategic, and Wilson Center and PPF through Gitane to do those things. So I cannot thank you guys enough. I truly am so, like, I know we're all friends and we've known each other for a long time, but I know you're all very busy and in demand right now. So the fact that you're willing to spend some time here with us is just, I really appreciate it. And I hope that you had a good time. I know I did. And I know we'll probably be doing this again, maybe after first 100 days or something like that.
Count me in.
Great. Thank you so much for having us, Mel.
Thanks,
guys. Take care.